Welcome to the Week 12 EXL Fantasy Show. I'm Derek Tate. So, we are just a mere 3 weeks away from the end of the regular fantasy football season in the EXL. Man, a lot of action and a lot of shaking of the standings, believe it or not, from Week 11's action. So, before we dive into a quick look at the standings and a quick Week 12 preview here in the EXL, let's kind of recap exactly what happened in Week 11. So, we'll start at the one of the main matchups of last weekend, and that was the Speedsters taking on the Holdouts. And both of those teams entered this contest at 7-3, and both were kind of jockeying for that number 2 seed along with the Vikings. And the Holdouts and the Speedsters did not exactly put on a big scoring performance. Both teams scored under 100 fantasy points, but it was the Holdouts who came out on top 91-82. And the quarterback performances from this one got some duds, to say the very least. The Speedsters and J.J. McCarthy continues to struggle outside of the fourth quarter, scoring just 6 fantasy points. But it was an even worse day for Justin Herbert with the Holdouts, and 3 fantasy points on the day as they just got blown out by the Jacksonville Jaguars. So it was really Jackson Smith-Njigba and Puka Nacua who did much of the heavy lifting for the Speedsters. Smith-Njigba had over 100 yards again and another 9 receptions, 18 fantasy points on the day. But on the flip side, it was a decent day for Jordan Love, who did have 2 passing touchdowns, not a ton of yardage, but still 17 fantasy points combined, with T. Higgins finishing with 13, had that receiving touchdown. The volume wasn't very high, but 3 receptions for 63 yards and a score. That helped lift the Holdouts to 8-3. So it was a huge win for them. The Speedsters dropped to 7-4 on the season. When we were taking a look at another matchup that has major implications for that number 2 seed right now, currently behind the Dudes, it was the Vikings and the Cazadors. And again, it was not too long ago. The Cazadors made a blockbuster trade to bring on Justin Jefferson to try to, bolster that wide receiver room. Unfortunately, as the aforementioned J.J. McCarthy continues to struggle, it has a ripple effect for Justin Jefferson, who finished with under 10 fantasy points, 5 receptions for just 61 yards, 8 fantasy points on the day for Justin Jefferson. Outside of that, Jahmyr Gibbs had a nice day, and Drake London, that's another thing moving forward for the Cazadors. Drake London suffering a PCL injury, but did finish this one with 7 receptions for 119 yards, finished with 17 fantasy points. But Josh Allen, last week anyway, 46 fantasy points, 6 touchdowns, 3 through the air, 3 on the ground. And then, of course, Travion Henderson also on Thursday Night Football against the New York Jets, finishing with 3 total touchdowns, over 100 total yards. A big day for Travion Henderson in consecutive games. So, and then, of course, George Pickens went off for 144 yards and a receiving score. And Trey McBride just continues to be money in the bank as Jacoby Brissett set an NFL record with 47 completions. And Trey McBride was a big beneficiary of that, catching 10 of those passes for 115 yards and a receiving score. So the Vikings, in blowout fashion, 181-126 over the Cazadors, as the Vikings improved to 8-3 along with the Holdouts, while the Cazadors, running out of time for them to be able to make a push towards the postseason, they dropped to 5-6 on the year, but still put up a respectable 126 in a losing effort. Now, taking a look around the rest of the EXL, the Dudes entered this contest 9-1 on the season with a 2-game lead in the win column for that number 1 overall seed, but they got upset by a 5-5 Crushers team that scored 123 points. The Dudes, without Daniel Jones and without Jonathan Taylor, who were on their respective bye week, only put up 101 fantasy points. And the Crushers, despite having a dud from Sam Darnold, still got a very nice day from Derrick Henry and Travis Kelce and Dak Prescott. So all 3 of those players scoring over 20 fantasy points did a lot of the heavy lifting for the Crushers on an off day for both Sam Darnold and Breece Hall. They improved to 6-5 on the year, while the Dudes allowed both the Vikings and the Holdouts to gain some ground on them, and they dropped to 9-2 on the season. Taking a look around the rest of the EXL, the Yachts improved to 6-5, getting above 500. It feels like maybe for the first time all season they have been a team. They did start out 3-0, but without Lamar Jackson, they went on a long 5-game losing streak, I think it was. But now they're back on a 3-game winning streak. So right back in the mix of things. They score 116 fantasy points despite the dud from Lamar Jackson. And then the Musketeers dropped to 3-8 at just scoring 92 points on the contest. Now, looking around the rest of the league, this was also another important matchup between the defending champion Degenerates and the Gamblers, the Gamblers entered this contest at 6-4. The Degens entered it at 5-5, but they come away with a huge win, 147-95 over the Gamblers. Now they pull even in the standings with them. Both teams sitting at 6-5, entering the final 3 weeks of the regular season in the EXL. For the defending champs, Christian McCaffrey just continues to shoulder the load and really be the most consistent fantasy producer on a week-to-week basis in the 2025 NFL season. 32 fantasy points. Travis Etienne, a nice day, 2 rushing touchdowns on the ground as they blow out the Los Angeles Chargers. Big day from Tyrone Tracy, who saw, I think, north of 20 total touches and really delivered with those opportunities. Had a big day, 15 fantasy points. It was actually 130 yards, I believe, in total, or 100. Yeah, I mean, right around north of 120. It's a good day for a Giants running back not named Cam Scatterbo in 2025. On the flip side, the Gamblers, it was a pedestrian day for Mahomes. Mahomes has been money in the bank all year in that quarterback one overall conversation all season long. Bijan Robinson went off 30 fantasy points, but it was not enough as the rest of the starting roster for the Gamblers, including Jamar Chase, who is now suspended for week number 12, only came away with 4 fantasy points. And outside of Bijan Robinson, it wasn't a great day for the Gamblers as they drop to 6-5. The Marauders and the Aces, 1 win combined heading into week 11 for these two teams. And finally, the Aces get in the win column. They topple the Marauders 138-98. And the Aces, it's been a rough season, but maybe some light at the end of the tunnel. A big day for Kenneth Gainwell as he got the start and went off once Jaylen Warren suffered an injury. Michael Wilson also 15 receptions for 185 yards. Remember that 47 passing completions that we got from Jacoby Brissett? Michael Wilson was the biggest beneficiary of that. And then George Kittle and Brock Purdy back in this starting lineup. And you see, as soon as those 2 players are healthy and back in the starting lineup for the Aces, they're a team capable of putting up north of 130 points on any given week. So good for the Aces. They get off the schneid. The Marauders drop to 1-10 on the year. And then I believe that may have been all the matchups in the action that took place in week 11. Now let's take a quick look at the standings. Again, the Dudes dropped to 9-2, but they still have a 1-game lead over both the Vikings and the Holdouts. But total points scored could come into play here if they pull even either the Vikings or the Holdouts with the Dudes over the final 3 games of the regular season. The Vikings are the league's top scorer by a wide margin at 1,636 fantasy points. That literally leads the Dudes by 200 points, who have only scored 1,436 on the year. And the Holdouts still within striking range to catch the Dudes as far as total points scored. They only sit at 1,401. They're trailing by 35 fantasy points, which can be made up in this scoring format in 1 game. But we'll have to see how these 3 teams finish over the final 3 weeks of the regular season. And don't count out the Speedsters quite yet for being in competition for that 1 or 2 seed entering the EXL postseason. They have 14-13 as far as total points scored on the year. So they're actually right there in between the Dudes and the Holdouts, but they are 1 back in the win column. So that loss this past week could be the difference once we get to the EXL playoffs and determine final seedings. But they are sitting at 7-4, still in strong position to make the postseason entering week number 12. Now things start to get really interesting for the 5 and 6 seed. And again, that 6 seed goes to the highest remaining scorer over record. So taking a look at right now, there are 4 teams competing for 2 spots, or at least for the 5 spot, with the 6-5 overall record. The defending champion Degens, then the Yachts at 6-5, the Crushers at 6-5, the Gamblers at 6-5 as well. The points tiebreaker, though, right now goes to the Degens. They're at over 1,500 total points scored. The Yachts just underneath of that at 1,487, so only 15 points separate the Degens and the Yachts. As far as the other remaining teams, the Crushers at 6-5, but their points scored are considerably farther behind both the Degens and the Yachts at 1,383. And then for the Gamblers, they're even further behind in the points scored total at 1,314. But of course, they're right there in the mix because they're still at 6-5, and they're only 1 game back of the Speedsters. So if the Speedsters, stumble down the stretch, it's going to be very interesting to see how these final 3 playoff spots in the EXL get determined. And one team, though, that's sitting at 5-6, but still very much in it, is the Cazadors, because right now they would actually have the 6th seed because they have 1,503 points scored, which is actually 1 point more than the Degens. And it's higher than the other 4 teams ahead of them in the win-loss column. So despite being in the standings currently sitting in 9th place, they are still certainly in the mix. And right now, if the season were to end today, I believe it would be the Cazadors who would secure that 6th seed over the Yachts because of points scored. Now, the Musketeers, the Marauders, the Aces, they are definitely, the Marauders and the Aces are officially eliminated from playoff contention in 2025. The Musketeers would have to win out and, score a ton of points. And they probably have to try to achieve that by achieve a playoff spot by being the 6th highest or the highest scoring remaining team for that 6th and final spot. But in all likelihood, they're pretty far out at 1,267 points. And they're 2 back in the win column of the Cazadors and 3 back of the 4 teams sitting at 6-5. So we'll go ahead and take a look at the scores, or not the scores, excuse me, a preview of Week 12's action. Now, we did have 1 game, and it was, again, a bit surprising. Good Josh Allen in Week 11, bad Josh Allen in Week number 12. And that gets the Vikings off to a bit of a slow start, entering their matchup against the 8-3 holdouts. Again, those are the 2 teams right now sitting at 2nd and 3rd, respectively, in the EXL standings. So the fact that it was a very pedestrian day for Josh Allen, and right now they sit at 8 points scored with arguably their biggest fantasy asset already played, certainly opens the door for the holdouts, but there's still a lot of football left to be played. Dalton Schultz was also in the starting lineup for the holdouts and finished with 1.8 fantasy points, so didn't exactly capitalize on Thursday night football, but Josh Allen off to a slow start. Both of these teams right now projected to score over 110 fantasy points, but it is the Vikings, as far as the projections go, that are favored at 129 to 113 over the holdouts. But yeah, I mean, it's anybody's matchup, and that is the game of the week in the EXL by, I'm not going to say a wide margin because there's a lot of important games, but that's the one that could have the biggest ripple effect or determination of how the playoff matchups go when the playoffs arrive after week number 14. Other matchups to keep an eye on: the Speedsters coming off of a loss. They're at 7-4. They're taking on the 3-8 Musketeers. Right now, the Speedsters are projected to, or ahead in the projections anyway, 123 to 96. The Musketeers did have Woody Marks play on Thursday Night Football. He finished with a modest 7.4 fantasy points. Other players worth keeping an eye on: Kenneth Walker's been on the injury report this week, as well as Xavier Worthy for the Musketeers. And it does look like the Speedsters now, with the injury to Michael Penix Jr., who has officially landed on injured reserve. And of course, Jackson Dart still dealing with an injury. It looks like J.J. McCarthy is going to get another start for the Speedsters, along with Trevor Lawrence. Going to be interesting to see if the Speedsters what that production looks like from the running back position. Ashton Genty only had 2 carries at halftime. 2 to 30 dropbacks for Geno Smith. against the Dallas Cowboys on Monday Night Football. They can't seem to get things figured out. Bishal Tootin also drawing the start at the running back 2 spot for the Speedsters. But, of course, it's the receivers that always get you on and excited on a weekly basis for this Speedsters team. The Cazadors, again, in the Yachts, this is a game with all kinds of playoff implications. Right now, the Yachts ahead in the win column, but these two teams are separated by a mere 16 points scored on the season, and the Cazadors are sitting at 5-6, but hold a 16-point scoring lead over the Yachts for the entire season. So this is a huge battle for the potential 5 or 6 seed for these two teams. The Yachts right now projected for 126 fantasy points. The Cazadors all the way up at 145 fantasy points. You just got to wonder, though, what are we going to get from Justin Jefferson, Devontae Smith? It seems as if the inconsistencies in the passing offense for the Philadelphia Eagles and the squeaky wheel being A.J. Brown on a weekly basis. Last week put up one of his worst performances of the season, did Devontae Smith. But still, the one thing that's going for the Cazadors, they got 25 fantasy points from James Cook on Thursday Night Football. So they've already got a nice little lead heading into the weekend, but certainly a lot of football left to be played. The Cazadors, though, get a huge performance from James Cook, and then you're also looking at, of course, your normal contributors like Jahmyr Gibbs, and hoping that you're getting more from Justin Jefferson. Jalen Warren's also another player to keep an eye on who picked up an injury last week. But yeah, a huge matchup for these two squads in that race for the 5 and 6 seed. Moving on, the Dudes coming off of a loss, an upset loss. They do get Jonathan Taylor and Daniel Jones back in the starting lineup, but they're facing off against a Kansas City team in a must-win scenario. Right now, the Dudes are projected for 121 fantasy points, but that's actually lower than what the D-Gens are projected for this week at 125. Now, 7 points from Nico Collins after the D-Gens made a huge trade right at the deadline to acquire Nico Collins. Collins had been tearing it up over the previous 3 games, had a slower night against the Buffalo Bills with just 3 catches for 55 yards. But still, this D-Gens squad is starting to round into form. Jacoby Brissett, hard not to put him in the starting lineup when in 5 straight games he's had over 250 passing yards and 2 touchdowns, and specifically with the Week 11 performance. But the Dudes do get back a couple of their big guns, and they really need A.J. Brown to have a big week against the Dallas Cowboys. And Ricky Pearsall, maybe more than 0 yards. He was on the field a lot. Brock Purdy's back under center, and it seems like Brandon Ayuk may not ever put on a Niners uniform again, according to reports from multiple sources. But the 49ers second-year receiver, Ricky Pearsall, got off to a fast start this season, got back in the lineup for the first time after missing more than a month of action, and was not very heavily involved, while George Kittle and Christian McCaffrey and even Juwan Jennings continued to eat. So interesting matchup for Ricky Pearsall entering week number 12 against the Carolina Panthers. The Crushers at 6-5, they're right there in the mix, and they've got a matchup against a 1-10 Marauder squad. Right now, they're favored 127-82. If the Crushers handle their business, they put themselves in a very nice position entering the final 2 weeks of the regular season. Already mentioned the Vikings and the holdouts, and then the Gamblers, who are also at 6-5. In a similar situation to the Crushers, they draw a matchup against a 1-10 Aces team, and they're actually projected right now behind the Aces. Again, a healthy Aces squad is not one that necessarily you can write in pen that it's going to be a win. The Aces did get 13 fantasy points from Christian Kirk, receiving touchdown to go along with 5 receptions for 54 yards. Right now, the Aces, even with, I believe, maybe the lineups may change here, but Alec Iomanor is in the starting lineup, and it seems that he has been ruled out for the matchup against Seattle. So who knows if the Aces are able to, take a look at their starting lineup. I have to assume that our team is going to take a look at their roster, but before action begins on Sunday. But as of right now, the Gamblers with Patrick Mahomes and Bijan Robinson and no Jamar Chase this week. That's what's been carrying this team for much of the year, is having arguably the quarterback one, the running back one, and the wide receiver one in fantasy football. And if you remove one of those players from the equation, it does a lot to hurt the floor of this team. And it looks like in light of the news that Jamar Chase's suspension for spitting on Jalen Ramsey has been upheld, at wide receiver, they're going to have to roll with Rashid Shaheed, who is still being kind of integrated into this offense after being traded from the Saints to the Seahawks. Jalen Coker, who had a nice game last week, but Bryce Young threw for over 400 yards, and it wasn't a monster performance for Jalen Coker, but still consistent in the offense. And then Parker Washington, who has had some nice moments ever since Brian Thomas and Travis Hunter suffered injuries. But Darius Slayton, Bam Knight also fill out the rest of the starting roster, along with Noah Fant in the tight end spot. And Mike Gesicki might be able to come back this week. We'll have to see if the Gamblers can get a couple above expectation performances from some of the other stars or starters not named Bijan Robinson and Patrick Mahomes in week number 12. That'll do it for this episode of the EXL Fantasy Show. And there's a lot of action left to be determined. But say this, with 9 teams still jostling for playoff position, entering the final 3 weeks, and many of them log jammed and right there within striking distance scoring-wise of one another, should be some exciting football in the EXL over the final 3 weeks. So until next time, everybody, later, says the Tater.